Well, hello everyone. My name is Sean Mayer. I'm a Christadelphian. I've been a follower of Jesus for around 35 years or so, and I live in Stirling in Scotland. And I'm going to talk to you today in this series, Jesus is Not God, about an encounter between Jesus and the Jewish leaders in John chapter 5. Now, in this chapter, which is shared on the screen here, Jesus had just healed a man. We see here in verse 8 of chapter 5, Jesus says to him, "Rise, take up your bed and walk." And immediately the man was made well and took up his bed and walked. Now, this causes a problem because the day that Jesus did this was the Sabbath day. We can see that in verse 9 and verse 10. This day was the Sabbath. And the Jews therefore said to him who was cured, "It's the Sabbath. It's not lawful for you to carry your bed." Now, actually, in the Jewish law, the Sabbath law was one of the 10 Commandments. And it simply said, remember, this is in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 8, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall do your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work." So carrying your bed after being healed could hardly be described as this man's work, his occupation, if you like. That's what the Sabbath law was about. It's about telling people, stop doing your daily work and focus on God and doing God's work. But these Jewish leaders, the religious leaders, forbade healing on the Sabbath, as well as things like carrying your bed and all sorts of other minutiae, very pedantic rules which they had created themselves. And so there's a kind of a double breach of their rules here by Jesus. A, he healed on the Sabbath, and B, he told the man to carry his bed, thus breaking their man-made rules. So, healing the sick clearly isn't customary. It's not an occupation. It was serving others. It was a miraculous act of the Lord Jesus. The Sabbath day should have been a day set aside for reflection, for worship, for God's work. And so what he was doing here was highly appropriate, not a problem, shouldn't have been a problem at all, but it was for these Jews. In fact, what he's doing here is giving us a foretaste of what the kingdom will be like when he returns again, because disability, along with disease, oppression, injustice, even ultimately death itself, all of these things are in the world that we live in today because of sin. And the work of Jesus and those who follow him when he comes back to the earth will be to systematically remove all of the effects of sin from the earth over a period of time. And these miracles that Jesus was doing were a foretaste of that wonderful time to come, but not for the Jewish rulers. They were blinded by their pride, by their self-righteousness, and all that they could see was one of their petty rules being broken, ignored, in fact, by Jesus as it deserved. So as we read on down in chapter 5, we see in verse 16 that for this reason, the Jews persecuted Jesus and sought to kill him because he had done these things on the Sabbath. Jesus' response to their accusation is fairly unremarkable, this response here. Jesus says that, don't you know that I need to be going about my Father's business here? My Father's been working until now, and I have been working. He puts them in their place and says, no, this isn't about your petty rules. This is about the work of God. This is about removing sin. This is about releasing this poor man from the terrible affliction that he had. But they weren't interested in any of that. All they were interested in was their control over the people, their interpretation, their extra rules that they had made. But this response from Jesus enrages the Pharisees even more, because in their twisted perception, claiming to be the Son of God was somehow, in their minds, a claim to equality with God. We see this in verse 18. Therefore, the Jews sought all the more to kill him, because he not only broke the Sabbath, but also said that God was his Father, making himself equal with God. Now, Jesus then goes on to spend the next 11 verses of this chapter pointing out that they are not only mistaken about the Sabbath, as he said before, they're also mistaken in their perception, in their view, that calling himself the Son of God makes himself equal with God. So there's a number of reasons why claiming to be the Son of God is not a claim or a declaration of equality. Just as a sort of slight aside here, it's interesting to note that this phrase or this description of Jesus as the Son of God is the only way those words, the order that those words appear in our Bibles. You may have heard the term God the Son. That phrase never appears in the Bible at all. That's a creation of human beings, that phrase, God the Son. So the Son of God, when the sonship of Jesus is being described, is only ever described in these terms, as the Son of God. And it's not a claim of equality at all. Of course, there's a natural argument outside of the Bible that in general terms, of course, a son is under his father's authority. That's the natural order of things, generally speaking. But more importantly, Jesus himself goes on to respond to this accusation by explaining to the Pharisees, the religious leaders, explicitly that he's subject to God and does not do and cannot do anything without God or out with God's authority. So have a look, first of all, at verse 19, the verse straight after this accusation from the Pharisees that you're claiming equality with God. Jesus answered them and said, most assuredly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of himself, but what he sees the Father do. For whatever he does, God does, the Son also does in like manner. Now that's like the natural relationship between a son and a father, isn't it? In some ways, you often see a son copying his father, looking up to, respecting, revering his father. And actually the relationship with Jesus, the relationship Jesus is describing here between him and his Father is like that. The Son can do nothing of himself, but what he sees the Father do, that's what he copies. That's what he does. The Son also does in like manner. And then we see in verse 21 another description of this type of relationship. For as the Father raises the dead and gives life to them, even so the Son gives life to whom he will. So God has the power to raise the dead and give them life. And so he has given that power and authority to Jesus. So Jesus follows his Father's example. You can see it makes sense. It's not illogical, is it? It's very straightforward in terms of this relationship. Let's keep going. Verse 22. For as the Father judges no one, but has committed all judgment to the Son, that all should honor the Son, just as they honor the Father. He who does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. And the bit I've highlighted there, for the Father judges no one, but has committed all judgment to the Son. In other words, he's given the authority to judge to the Son. That's not a relationship of equality. That's a relationship of deference. That's a relationship within which there's a hierarchy. The Father has committed to the Son the power and authority to judge. A slightly different angle now from Jesus in verse 24, continuing in his response to this accusation that you are claiming to be equal with God. Jesus says, most assuredly, I say to you, he who hears my word and believes in him who sent me has everlasting life and shall not come into judgment. Jesus says he was sent by someone. Again, he didn't decide of his own accord. He was sent by someone. That's a position of authority over someone if you send them. If I say to someone, go and do something, and they go and do it, they are under my authority. They are under my instruction. And there's a hierarchy of relationships there. And likewise in verse 26, another example, for as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son to have life in himself, and has given him authority to execute judgment also, because he is the Son of Man. So his humanity is being his humanity, but also his authority over mankind, over humanity, is being explained here too. So the Father has life in himself, and he has granted the Son to have life in himself. So clearly what's being described here is not a relationship which is equal. There is not an equality here. There is a hierarchy. One is in authority over the other. Look down at verse 30, another example, and really clear here, very explicit. Jesus says plainly, I can of myself do nothing. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is righteous, because I do not seek my own will, but the will of the Father who sent me. So all of those things being brought together here in this last verse that we're looking at, verse 30. Jesus does nothing of his own initiative. He takes commandments and instruction from God. Let's scroll down a little bit further. We can see in verse 36 that Jesus has been given some instructions. He's been given a job to do by God. Again, that denotes hierarchy. I have a greater witness, he says in verse 36, than John's. This is talking about John the Baptist. For the works which the Father has given me to finish, the very works that I do bear witness of me that the Father has sent me. So there's that sending again here, but this is the phrase we're interested in here. The Father has given me a job to finish, and those are the works that I do. So he's heard God's instruction, and he's been given the job by God, his Father, and he's now doing that. So it's clearly a relationship in which there is hierarchy. There is one in authority over the other. Again, a slightly different angle on this in verse 37 to again denote that there's difference between the Lord Jesus and his Father. Verse 37 we read, and the Father himself who sent me has testified of me. You have neither heard his voice at any time nor seen his form. So God is invisible, has not been seen, cannot be seen by human beings in their mortal state. But Jesus was seen. He was touched and handled. He was heard. Again, so there's a very significant difference between the Lord Jesus and his Father. So you can see here that there's this accusation that you're making yourself equal with God. And Jesus then in these verses we've been looking at here quite clearly shows that he is not equal with God, and he is not claiming to be equal with God. A couple of final points before we draw things to a conclusion. In verse 44, we have another interesting, as Jesus rounds off his conversation here with the religious rulers. He says that he's not interested in receiving honor from men. In contrast, that is to the religious rulers who were all about getting honor from men and giving honor to one another. Jesus, by contrast, was coming in his Father's name. Here we read in verse 43. Here's Jesus' condemnation. How can you believe who receive honor from one another and do not seek the honor that comes from God? And then Jesus says, do not think that I shall accuse you to the Father. There is one who accuses you, Moses, in whom you trust. For if you believed in Moses, we read in verse 46, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. So that's interesting, isn't it? Jesus takes them back to Moses. This appears to be an implicit reference back to the declaration made at the inception of the nation of Israel, when they were given a law and commandments to refrain from the pagan polytheism of the nations around about them. Their idolatry involved the worship of multiple gods, the worship of the natural world, of Mother Nature, the sun, the moon, and the stars, of animals, and also their religions often incorporated abhorrent practices that involved sexually immoral behavior and child abuse and even child sacrifice. These were the things that Israel were told to keep away from. And instead, they were told to worship the one true God, the living God. And we find that passage in Deuteronomy chapter 6, back in the first 5 books of the Bible. In chapter 4 of Deuteronomy chapter 6, here we read, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength." And those are the words quoted by Jesus earlier on in his ministry, when he's talking to those who ask him, which is the greatest commandment? And he says, it's this one, that you should hear and understand that God is one. And the word in the New Testament is monos. And in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, here it's the same. The Lord is one. He is an individual being. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And that's what Jesus himself did. And that's not the only place that Jesus is referred to by Moses. If we come down to Deuteronomy chapter 18, here in Deuteronomy chapter 18, we find there's a prophecy about Jesus. Moses says here in Deuteronomy 18 and verse 15, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your midst, from among your brethren, him you shall hear." And then he goes on to say, if we come down to verse 18, again emphasizing the humanity of this prophet, "I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brethren, and I will put this is the really important bit, I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. And it shall be that whoever will not hear my words, which he speaks," so my words, God's words, "which he speaks in my name, I will require it of him." So there's judgment associated with ignoring the words of this prophet who's speaking God's words. Now, how do we know that that's Jesus? Well, when we go back to John chapter 5, we can see that Jesus here in verse 46 and 47 accuses the Pharisees, the religious rulers, of not believing Jesus' words and of not believing Moses' words that were spoken of Jesus. If you do not believe his writings, Moses' writings, how will you believe my words? And Jesus almost quotes those words that we've just read in John 18, verse for verse, word for word, in John chapter 12. If we come down in John chapter 12, towards the end of the chapter here, we read that Jesus says, let's go down to verse 46, "I have come as a light into the world, that whoever believes in me should not abide in darkness. And if anyone hears my words and does not believe, I do not judge him. For I did not come to judge the world, but to save the world. He who rejects me and does not receive my words has that which judges him. The words that I have spoken will judge him in the last day." So you can see that Jesus is referring back here to those words spoken by Moses. And remember in Deuteronomy 18, we read that he will speak the words, my words, God's words. And that's what Jesus says here, verse 49. "I have not spoken on my own authority, but the Father who sent me gave me a command what I should say and what I should speak." So there's Jesus very clearly associating himself with Moses, the words of Moses, which foretold the coming of the prophet who would speak the words of God, the words which God gave him, a prophet who was raised up from among his brethren. So when we see them side by side like this, the link is quite clear that Jesus was that prophet. And the wonderful thing in conclusion is that the words which Jesus spoke here in verse 50 were words of everlasting life. Words of everlasting life. And the empty tomb declares this truth to us. If we, unlike the Pharisees, unlike those religious rulers who with all of their man-made rules, all of their petty observances, which were not what God intended from the law that he gave his people, if we're like them and we don't hear the words of Jesus, then we are without hope in this world. But the empty tomb declares to us the truth of these words, that faith in God and following the words of God as spoken by Jesus and all of the others who were inspired by him to speak gives us a wonderful hope in this hopeless world. And that hope is that the grave will have no power over us. Even if we die, the grave will have no power over us, because when Jesus comes again, as he says multiple times in John's Gospel, that he will raise us up to life everlasting. Now, there's something that's really good to look forward to in this troubled world. And we hope and pray it won't be long before Jesus is here again. Thank you for listening.